and welcome to the Disability Education and Society podcast. This is a podcast for collective learning and unlearning in the struggle for intersectional liberation. We focus on educational realms, expanding to other societal areas. We share our stories as academics as well as those of our featured guests, including disability activists involved with multifaceted dimensions of systems equity, self-determination efforts, anti-ableist, and anti-racist liberation. Join us as co-conspirators. Today's episode features Rhonda Bondie. Rhonda is an associate professor in special education at Hunter College and the director of the Hunter College Learning Lab. Rhonda began teaching as an artist in residence and then spent over 20 years in urban public schools as both a special and general educator. Rhonda's co-authored book, Differentiated Instruction Made Practical, was recently translated into Portuguese and is used by teachers in more than 30 countries to ensure all learners are thriving every day. Rhonda's research examines how teachers develop inclusive teaching practices through new technologies available at www.agileteacher.org.
Hi, Rhonda. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us in the DES podcast. We are very excited about the conversation we're going to have with you, and it's centering this idea of transforming fear into rigor, love, freedom, and joy in education. So to start us off, we would like you to share a little bit about your personal story, anything related to your journey in relation to disability.
Mhm. Well, I think, like many young children, as growing up, you witness and experience disability. I witnessed first by watching my grandparents change in their abilities as they aged and growing up in the farmland, and thinking about how they would be independent and how they would use different abilities that they had as they um, lost all different kinds of physical, hearing, and sight capacities as they aged, and really framing. I think it helped to ground my ideas about disability in terms of just being part of a natural human experience. So I think that was an important experience as a child. But what impacted me most in my teaching was when I was a young person. I was an artist in residence in schools, and I used to do drama and dance in the schools. And uh, I was in Brooklyn, and we had a 3-year grant to do social studies through drama. And the principal asked me if I could work with all children in the school in the 5th grade. And there were 4 classes, but we only had money in the grant for 3 classes. And so I said, sure, I would stay and work an extra class, which meant like going through lunch. So it ended up being the whole day. So I couldn't take an afternoon job. So I had to take a different night job. It became very complicated to ensure that all children got to be in the play and got to participate in the year-long process of writing this play in social studies. And on the day of the play, the press was there. CBS News did a Sunday morning, thing, and it was really beautiful and brilliant. We had done this incredible play, and I got interviewed, and I said yes, and I'm most proud that all students were part of the play. And a teacher came up to me after that interview and said, "My students were not part of the play. You shouldn't have, you didn't include all students." And I was maybe 20 years old. I was very young, and I had no idea. So I went to the principal and I said, I stayed all day. I took a different job at night. Who was not included in the play? Like, somebody said their children weren't included in the play. And upon investigation, I found out that students who were deaf and hard of hearing were taught in a girls' shower room that had been converted into a classroom, kind of behind the gym, in a hallway. I'd never even been down in the building, and that's where the children were. I found them, and the teacher, and she had made the classroom beautiful. She had put in carpet, and I mean, it was a delightful, just bright and wonderful place, all hidden. And sure enough, there were three students who were in the fifth grade in that group. And I felt awful about it. Um, I cried the whole way back into the city, and I couldn't imagine how hurt they must have been not to be in the play. And my boss told me to stop crying and to find out what it would take to include the students. And it was a 3-year grant. I couldn't change what had happened this year, but I could change what I did in my teaching going forward. And I thought that was the best advice anybody gave me. So at NYU was very nice. They helped me learn how I could include the deaf children and taught me sign language. Over the summer, I became certified in special ed, and we went forward and included the students. And that process of watching the teachers become friends, the students then became included. All day long for many different subjects. The students became friends with each other. They had never talked to each other before. And I realized that we really shouldn't have general ed and special ed or even inclusion. Everyone should just be in school uh, from that experience. And it really helped me to ask important questions when I come to a school and really investigate for who is in the school. Um, Really getting to know the people in the school and really really foundationally making sure that everyone is together when I'm teaching. So that was it has definitely shaped everything that has happened since then.
I have to comment about this because I think I have mentioned to you, and I have probably mentioned this in the podcast before, that I went to quote unquote an inclusive setting as a default because there was no legislation and there wasn't any real special education yet in the 1970s in Venezuela. And I'm pretty sure that if there had been um, special education, I would have been excluded by default. So I feel like these legislative solutions that we develop to quote unquote include folks with disabilities are paradoxically part of the problem, right? Because we create they are walls. They are essentially policy walls that play with difference and demarcate things in legalistic terms. And so these fundamental what you said about it's just being in school, the being together,
Mhm.
the process of becoming part of a class. You know, I went to the classroom with such and such, and I became friends with this or that. Those kinds of things cannot happen if kids are not in school. Not even if they are partially there. You know, like they come for 1 hour and they take them somewhere else, because all of that creates dynamics that are artificial, and children feel the artificialness of that. Yeah. So I really appreciate your story because I think it highlights the why of our passion, and I'm including Paulo in this boat about so-called inclusion, and we're trying to push even beyond the word inclusion, because when you are including, you're already acknowledging the exclusion. You're already recognizing um, that you're sort of hosting somebody in because you've excluded them first. So that there is a genealogy that's tied to exclusion in inclusion, if that makes any sense. So thank you for that story. And I love the fact that this is an artistic experience, um, because the arts are, and this is not the right word, inclusive by definition. I mean, anybody can experience the arts in different ways. That creativity space, I think, is what should be at the roots of learning. Right? It's part of. I think This will probably connect to some of the conversations we're going to have later.
As I was listening to your story, Rhonda, and thank you for sharing that, I thought a lot about educators. And so your role in one, right, seeing the problem, and then two, collectively trying to rectify it. And so that was really nice to learn that there are many educators across the country and the world who do this kind of work, and there are also many that don't. And so I think that the power of educators to me really came out strongly there. And I'll share a really quick story too, because it made me think about I, we're going to talk about this article that you co-wrote, and reading that article also had a lot of the embodiment that you shared here, and that to me that article had a lot of this idea of what we're trying to, what we'll be talking about here shortly. To quickly come back to like a quick story is that my son, who just graduated last year, so this past May, what was really troubling was that they had a graduation, of course, for all 12th graders graduating, and they wanted to exclude my son because they felt he would not do well in the graduation. The noise would be too overwhelming for him, and so they proposed that all of the kids in that room, and he's had a special education room, would be in that room until their names are called, and once their names are called, they're going to return back to that room. And so that was the proposed inclusion of students into their 12 years worth of schooling. And so, I mean, this again kind of highlights both of your stories, like this inclusion by exclusion, right? And in the case where I mentioned there are educators who are tirelessly working towards having students have the best experience, there are those, I feel like, in the case of my son, that were just trying to please whoever they wanted to please, but not centering disabled students in graduation. It's very much of a marginal inclusion, if it's any even considered inclusion at all. So just wanted to share that story because that came up for me, and then to return to what we're here for in this podcast is that your co-author article titled "Transforming Fear into Rigor, Love, Freedom, and Joy: A New Paradigm of Standards-Based Reform" is what we're going to be having you share a lot more about here today, Rhonda. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what interested me about this work is the genealogy of this work. And so you note that in the article, in the liberatory spirit of Black scholars. And so can you say a little bit more about that genealogy and share that with those engaging in this podcast?
Mm-hmm. Our work, research partners and co-authors in this article and several others is Akani Zusho and Rethi Kumar. And they're both educational psychologists. And so we are always looking for this interdisciplinary, these intersections between cognitive science, motivation science, culturally relevant pedagogy, and practice. And so we have kind of a several papers over time that we've been exploring these intersections and how can we bring research into practice through these intersections. So this paper began by really thinking about culturally relevant pedagogy standards for teachers. And we started by critiquing those standards and noticing the neutral language in the standards and the lack of specificity in the standards, to the extent that we felt the standards couldn't really be operationalized to make any kind of changes in school whatsoever, because they were so nondescript and neutral that they weren't really talking about race. They weren't talking about exclusion. They weren't talking about inequities that the standards should be remedying. So that's where it started. And then we got reviewer feedback on the first paper, and we then focused more on the history of standards. And we were also, it was just, we started working on the paper during 2020, and we got interested in where are the intersections of the themes between Black scholars and educational psychology. Educational psychology is primarily quantitative, often by white scientists, and shapes much of our testing, shapes much of the things related to standards in our school system. And the school system perpetually does not serve all students. Black scholars, on the other hand, often are using more qualitative methods, more methods grounded in the community. And so we got to thinking, well, are there any intersections? Are there overlaps between themes from Black scholars' research on education, envisioning what education could be and should be? And if you look at the success of Black educators, particularly women educators before Brown versus Board, right? They could teach students to be in a world that didn't exist, right? They produced all kinds of leaders through their pedagogy. And so we got interested in those intersections and illuminating the intersections between educational psychologists and Black scholars, and then using those intersections to critique standards as what we're seeking to achieve in education, and really thinking about, could we suggest a new paradigm where the quality of the experience, both in process and product, is the ultimate outcome that we're seeking. And when we look to those qualities, if we looked at those intersections, we found love, joy, rigor, which is, I think, personified by this idea of standards, and freedom or agency as really being the key themes that could create a new North Star. So that's how the paper, we worked on it over 2 years, and I hope that it's very inspirational for practitioners, especially now when people seem to really be searching for what is the new idea of schooling coming out of COVID.
This idea of rigor, you associated just now with the standards, but can you think of other ways of embodying or enacting rigor that connect more explicitly with joy, love, and freedom? Because part of the problem with rigor is that it tends to be associated with
pain.
Yeah, there is this binary construct around rigor, right? This is either rigorous or not rigorous. Yeah, right. So people start going to methodological. It's almost like the medieval tendency of trying to find out how many angels you could feed into the top of a pin or whatever. I mean, these weird discussions that were essentially methodologically irrelevant, but they were very important theological questions, quote unquote. And I think with rigor, you're almost getting into this science of rigor in its own right, which is perpetuating the whole neutrality game, and for the sake of quote unquote objectivity, that there is a need to disconnect it from real things. So could you say a little bit more about this paradox of rigor being, as it's typically read by quote unquote experts in assessment, especially, and how it is typically read by these communal leaders that you're talking about, the communal pedagogists that brought for centuries, even in contexts where they were prohibited and could be punished with death. When slaves were being educated, because they even found ways to educate even in those contexts where the plantation was going on, and many of those pedagogues were doing things that were punished with death, and they still did it. They still knew how relevant it was to find this sense of freedom, agency, and find joy and love in the middle of mystery, in the middle of the worst painful kinds of sufferings that these people were undergoing.
It's an interesting word, because I don't like rigor, because I work a lot with teachers all around the world, and when you translate rigor, it becomes stiff and dead and petrified, kind of, which is the opposite really of
Well, it's cadavers. You have with cadavers the rigor that's
right, with
supposedly used to
cadavers,
examine how
exactly,
somebody died, and they examine
right,
the rigor mortis, which is sort of
right,
this Latin thing to say, oh, how was the
exactly.
death produced? Oh,
So
yeah,
it's a very United States kind of term to be used in education, I think. Very popular in education psychologists. So my co-authors really prefer the word rigor. But me being a classroom teacher who goes around the world, I kind of prefer the word optimal challenge. And the meaning that you're really after is that learning is not going to be relevant and satisfying if it doesn't have some challenge to it. As humans, we need a little bit of challenge to get us interested. And as a practitioner, I just couldn't find a definition in the literature for rigor or optimal challenge that I thought really could be useful for educators. So I came up with a sort of a formula, if you will, that I think is very practical, that I'll share with you. So if you think about optimal challenge, it's two ideas multiplied together. And the two ideas are effort and complexity. And effort, to me, means the energy that it would require to sustain focus for a particular amount of time. So, how much energy would it require for a student to sustain their focus on this task for a long time or a short time? And that can change the amount of effort it takes. If you're asking someone to work very quickly, or if you're asking them to sustain interest for a long period of time, that changes the amount of effort it takes to really harness your energy and to generate energy for the task. So that's effort. Complexity could be divided into the number of parts, the ways the parts fit together, and the thinking required to manipulate those parts. So, what kind of thinking is required to move the parts around, and how many parts are you moving to make greater meaning? So, I think when when I think about challenge as a teacher, I always think about the effort and the complexity, because you can adjust any of those levers that I just mentioned. Like for effort, you could adjust the amount of time, you could adjust the amount of time on a sustained focus, um, and you could pay attention to what kind of energy is this requiring from the student. In complexity, of course, teachers are good at adjusting the number of parts, but not so much always thinking about the ways the parts fit together and thinking about the thinking that is being required to manipulate those parts. Um, and so I think that's a practical way to think more about the challenge, and to think about every single task as having challenge, and that can be made more optimal for the learning conditions when thinking very specifically about the parts that are creating the challenge in the
Mm.
experience.
Hi there. While we intend to make our podcast as accessible as possible, we ask those that have the financial means to support us by subscribing as a patron to our podcast for as little as $5 a month. To subscribe, go to our website, disabilityed.podbean.com. By subscribing as a patron, you will help ensure that we can continue to create and share new episodes while supporting other co-conspirators who face financial and health difficulties. For those with financial difficulties, please connect with us about obtaining a free copy of our books and/or engaging in additional conversations with us. You can also support this show by hitting the follow button, share this podcast with among your network, and leave us a comment and positive rating. Your support means so much.
I'm wondering because I'm thinking of the lesson plan, which is sort of the typical unit that teachers tend to use to think of this combination of effort and complexity. In theory, the lesson plan is also neutral. It's supposed to impact all the students the
In the same way.
Yeah, even if you differentiate.
Given the same amount of time.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you plug something like difference, ability differences,
Into the
racial
lesson.
differences, gender differences, and class differences that tend to be connected to a lot of these efforts and complexities. Just go and buy in the supermarket such and such, and everybody assumes that everybody will have, $50, $100 to
Right.
go and purchase whatever for this science experiment that they're gonna do in school. You see what I mean?
Yes,
But
absolutely.
all of a sudden, people with certain income brackets are excluded
Yes.
from the lesson plan, and they will not be able to. It's that bracketed impact of difference in how this formula could work in a contexted uh, sort of situational thing. So how could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I have two strategies for teachers. One is to plan with an at, if, then, so, and if statement. So at each point in the lesson, however you want to divide up your lesson, it could be beginning, middle, and end, would be easy. Maybe it's at the opening, at the group work, at the mini lesson, however you think about the segments of your lesson. And you could also do it more broadly when thinking about the whole curriculum at the first unit or second unit, but at gives you the place that you're at. So at blank, if some, all, or individual students, so you have to think about students in different ways, some, all, or individual students have or need. So maybe they have background knowledge, they need vocabulary, they have materials at home, they might need materials at home for the example you just used. So it's at this point, if all, some, or individual students need or have X, whatever it might be, then blank. How are you going to adjust instruction? So, and the so is really important because most differentiated instruction ends with these random kind of adjustments. I'm going to give 3 of this, or I'm going to give the students this, but you're going to give the students materials. So what change in student work would you expect to see? And this is how you'll measure the outcome of the teaching adjustment. So what change in student work would you see? Then change in student work. And if I see the change, then what will you do? Will you continue it? What will happen? If you don't see the change, then what will happen? So it's at, if, then, so, and if. At the point in the lesson, if all, some, or individual students have or need, then what you're going to do, the teaching move. So the change in student work and if, whether you see the change or not, what are you going to do? So it kind of leads to a cycle. And this kind of mental thinking can be done in the shower, you know, maybe not while driving, but in New York City, we can do it on the train on the way to school, thinking about 1 or 2 points in every lesson we teach, and thinking that mental flexibility, imagining that all students will have and will need different things at different points of the lesson, and mentally preparing how we're going to adjust our teaching, I think makes the lesson plan start to turn into a much more flexible document than
Mm.
a linear progression of actions, because you have these if then statements and always measuring uh, the effectiveness of your move by the change in student work you expect to see. Because I think oftentimes people think, oh, I'll give students a graphic organizer, I'll give them this, and this will make it accessible. I'll give them a book on tape. Now it's accessible. But what is the change that you're really after in the student learning? And if the change isn't going to occur by the graphic organizer, well, then we need to think of something different. So I think like that is the best way to think about that. I also sometimes like to think about lesson plans as a series of plays, like a sports team. And if you think about plays in a sports team, they're based on a situation. When we're in this situation, we're going to make this form, and each person has a purpose in the play, and then they move together as a team to carry it out. And that's really what we're doing in class. And we have very common situations like review, introduction, correction, gathering responses. Those things can be organized in terms of plays that are routines. That works really well for all the students in the class because they're in on the lesson plan. Plays are visual, they're shared with the team. It's not like the teacher is leading students who have no idea where they're going. Uh, Everybody knows, oh, this is a moment where we're in review. We know how we work together to review information uh, as a team. And so I think that's also, and you can just put those plays within the linear lesson plan that's often required by school administration. It doesn't mean that you have to turn in something that's rigid and linear and does not expect students to and learning to unfold in surprising and challenging ways. But instead, you can expect surprises and challenges just like a sports team does as the game unfolds, and feel equipped uh, to follow, to engage in those surprises and challenges uh, with enthusiasm and confidence because you have some tools to help you in that situation. So I think that's really what a lesson plan needs to be.
This is Paulo's terrain, so I
Mhm.
shouldn't even been asking this question, but I'm sure Paulo has some more insights to converse with you about this.
I think one thing that came to mind as you're talking about like the world, the teacher, and you're kind of talking about plays and the role of the teacher there, it made me think of something from the article that really stuck out, which you and your co-author stated. Many teachers leave programs thinking that motivation is a personality trait rather than a
Yeah.
function of the environment that they co-create with students. So that I felt that that was a really powerful quote, and resonated with my experiences when speaking to educators who some of them will talk about motivation. Well, that's the student is not motivated, they have no motivation to do this. And yeah, like very much what you said, uh blame it on the student, and something's wrong with the student, they can't get motivated. So my question to you then is like, then because then you talk about love, freedom, and joy, and I feel like there are many connections there, between like motivation, right? Rigor,
Mhm.
love, freedom, and joy. If you could share a little bit more about these ideas, and how you are thinking there.
Yes. That's a great connection. So we always teach teachers the secrets to motivation, which is ABCM: autonomy, belonging, competence, and meaning. So all students are motivated. They might not be able to harness their motivation given the environment and the task. So, how can we help them do that? We can increase opportunities for autonomy or agency, which is related to freedom. We can increase opportunities for meaning, which is often related to love. It could be related to joy, right? Feeling joyful and inspired by a topic or feeling passion for a topic. Belonging is definitely related to love, can also be related to joy. So those can kind of overlap. And love for your for the topic, being interested in it, love for yourself, love for the people that your community that you're learning with, love for the way that you're learning something. Um, you know, that can be so that's connected often to belonging. Also, just really students feeling like they belong in learning this topic. They not just belong in the space, but that's important, belong with the people in the community, that's important, and they also belong in the curriculum. The curriculum somehow has meaning in their life. ABC and competence, I think, is a really important one because it's not just knowing what you're able to do, but it's also knowing the questions that you have and what you need to learn. So you can feel really competent and be completely lost if you know you're lost. So and that has a lot to do with freedom, being able, feeling equipped to pursue interests that you have and feeling equipped to engage with the challenges that occur when you're learning. So I think love, joy, rigor, and freedom are definitely overlapped with the core feelings that help us harness our intrinsic motivation. I think if you focus on motivation, you get pretty far toward love, joy, rigor, and freedom, but maybe not all the way. So I think love, joy, rigor, and freedom kind of takes us even further.
I mean, I don't want us to um, go out today without talking a little bit about this joy, the idea of joy as a learning outcome. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm going to share with you a story that Paula and I experienced together, um, where we were trying to plan for an IEP. And for people who are not in the United States, again, IEPs are these individualized education program things that are built into what students with disability have to go every year. And it's sometimes it takes the entire time that students with disabilities are in schools, even in kinder, even in preschool context, that they undergo at least an annual meeting to deal with these goals and all this kind of thing. And um, a lot of the forms that the states have keep saying that the goal has to be measurable, um, and they connect to standards. And as you said, the standards are very much neutral and disconnected from any reality, um, any issue of difference, race, ability, etc. So um, the outcome standards are not very useful. And we were trying to emphasize process standards in mathematics goal setting. And Paul and I have co-authored a book that came out. We co-authored it with two other folks. It was four of us talking about this notion of goal setting in IEPs and talking about process standards. And it, the teachers were very resistant to this idea. And what I'm trying to think of is, especially thinking of joy. I mean, the fact that they think that joy is not measurable. And there's all kinds of surveys to measure happiness, for instance. I mean, I know that the social psychology world measures joy all the time in the form of happiness. But in education, the perception from teachers, from a lot of practitioners, is that this is not measurable and it's not going to fly when it comes to these kinds of goals that are going to drive interventions and a lot of things for people with disabilities. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of joy as a learning outcome connected to both motivation, but also connected to things like process standards or ways to make this part of something like an IEP or something of
Right.
those sort of things.
Right. I think it might be difficult for teachers who are using a software program and they're like pulling down goals from a database of goals.
Mm.
It might be very difficult to find a goal that you think is measuring something like joy or love or the extent students felt challenged or freedom, agency. If you just wanted to look at how independent uh, was a student, that might be really challenging. I think that would be our ultimate goal. Is that in these software programs there were such kinds of goals?
Yeah, but
Um,
yeah, but part of the issue with IEPs is that they're by law supposed to be co-created with the family, and
right.
at least a member of the parents was pushing for
For the
these kinds of goal setting, and they were requesting it. So it was not even a question of whether um, somebody with some sort of um, power to claim this was not asking it. They
right.
were just refusing to go along with the family, this particular family member, in dealing with these issues of process standards or all kinds of things. That they were just refusing to go there because they wanted to have goals that were
Smart
in
goals.
many
Yeah.
ways meaningless. I mean, in being
Right.
measurable, they were meaningless. We're going to achieve such and such just by increasing whatever
Right.
this
Increasing
knowledge in
explicit
science and
instruction
mathematics. Yeah, and they were just doing it very
3 times a week. Yeah.
exactly
Yeah.
something very mechanical.
Yeah.
That's how it felt, and they were
I
refusing to be co-creative with the
right.
family in this process.
Right. So I think those pull downs are part of the problem because you're not actually writing goals together with the family and the student. And so it leads to the teacher in this one place that's kind of controlled almost by these pull down menus. So I think like that's a part of the problem. So how do we deal with that problem? I think, well, one thing I think is really helpful is thinking about street data and what kind of data are we collecting in this IEP, and to invite teachers to read the IEP, perhaps before the meeting, the previous IEP, and see if they can tell the story, build a narrative of this student from what we know from the IEP. And it might, the lever might be the assessments that you're using to measure progress toward the goal. And if we start to look at those assessments, how close is the data to the student? And how close is it to the goals that the student has articulated that they are most interested in working toward? um, and so I think like that might be a place that where everyone could engage. Like, what is the story, what is the narrative that this assessment data tells us, and is that the story of the student, and is that the story of the student's learning that the student is aspiring toward? And if it's not, maybe we could start to change the assessments. And I think like it's kind of a conversation between the goals and the assessments.
Hmm.
And I feel like sometimes when we start at the goal level, it's it's very hard to get everybody on the same page. But if we start at the story of the student's learning, which a student can present themselves, um, and so I've been encouraging the students that I work with to look at the work that they've done throughout the week, and to tag moments where they felt love, either loved by the community, love for themselves. When were they encouraged to do something loving for themselves on the weekend or in the class? Or what would be an act of love for yourself? And how would that um, be encouraged by the program that you're currently in. So to tag those moments of love, joy, challenge, and agency or freedom, and then to bring together evidence from your work to your IEP meeting of how learning is playing out for you. These are moments where I'm feeling loved. These are ways I've felt agency. And to look, is that, what story does that tell us? What's missing from there? Usually moments come up where the student will say, I really don't feel any belonging or association in these classes for these reasons. But then we can start to see, to start to build the narrative. And from that narrative, well, how do we want the narrative to change? Well, in these ways, let's set goals to achieve those changes. And so I feel like that might be a way to get toward this new North Star, is by starting very close to the student story that they're experiencing every day in their lives at school, and how they're bringing school into the rest of their lives outside of school.
And that seems to be part of the problem with students with disabilities in general, is that they are perceived so much from a deficit lens that the human nature is seen in deficit ways. So even those kinds of things, Kant thought, for instance, that women could not experience the sublime, that it was just only for rational, manly, whatever. I think in a way, a lot of teachers unfortunately think that people with disabilities, certain types of students with disabilities, are just unable to experience these higher level sentiments or dimensions, and of course that prevents them from even exploring those questions. By the way, I really want to say that I appreciate seeing this street data book reference that you had in the article. I was not familiar with the book, and I downloaded it. I was really struck by the power of using that approach in terms of assessment, and I think in terms of many other kinds of applications that it could have beyond schooling. I really invite postcast folks to take like an account of that particular book, the street data book, because it's really powerful.
I think, like, to bring humanity and humanizing qualities into the IEP, I do think, like, starting with the narrative of the student or a story might really help to change that from sort of a clinical type, these are the measurable goals, like a business transaction, more into the story of someone's life, like a human life, and how we aspire for this life to unfold.
Right. In one of the things that tends to be required in IEP forms is asset based elements, and you will notice that it tends to be the shortest. And it's not just that it's short; is that it's a very superficial
Right.
portion of the IEP.
And
Yeah,
often not related, right? Not
yeah,
related to the
exactly, to learning at all. It's
like the
he
student is
smiles.
friendly.
Yeah, he smiles a lot. He's a friendly. I mean, these vague adjectives that don't say anything, and they are totally disconnected from the learning process. So it's really difficult to engage, because even if you tell stories, they're still reading the stories from a distance. Like when you're reading the story of this cutie dog that did a trick here and there, because they are assuming that it's a dog and it's not a human. It's a subhuman category just by having, or by being labeled with a disability of whatever kind.
Yeah, and I think that uh, to go back to Alexis's story in just full transparency. It's okay, Alexis. This is a story about Alexis and I working on my son's IEP, and I was the parent who pushed for these better mathematics goals as a math educator, knowing how important those are, and how I was very intentional about the strength section, about getting the IEP team members to, hey, let's talk about this, let's put this down. And then at the same time, to what Alexis just mentioned, that okay, that's nice. We have this nice paragraph down, but the rest of the IP has nothing to do with that
Right.
paragraph, because then we get kind of sucked into the deficits. Okay, how we're going to fix this problem, and forget about everything that we wrote about these awesome things
Exactly.
about my son. And so I really appreciate and felt this desire of having these kind of what you mentioned, um, aspirations for standards that are connected to joy and freedom. And that if educators and parents and IEP members had access to this pull down menu that had these goals, right, rather than these other sort of horrible IEP cookie cutter goals that are out there, like if we have access to that and say, oh, what about this one? I mean, we can highlight the joys of the student that connects to their narrative,
Right.
their desires, and that would make those conversations so much
So different.
more powerful, and really center the student,
Right.
and avoid this what I often find in self-determination conversations is about I want to become a better worker, right? I want to have these skills so I could serve others. I mean these kind of things that are very much aligned to, again, these neoliberal agendas, but I think what you're saying in your articles are very different, from those aspects. And so uh, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that aspect.
I feel like we need like steps for right now. Like, what can you do right now, so that listeners feel like they could take action? And like a small thing you could do right now is take the goals that are in the IEP and sort them under the category of which goals would support or build feelings of love, which goals would result in feelings of joy, which goals would result in feelings of challenge, which goals would result in feelings of freedom and agency, and see if the goals could be sorted in that little activity. Doesn't require you to change the software or the IEP, but could be done at, as a in that conversation might really help teachers to think about, well, the whole team to think about how we are, what we're doing, how we're assessing what we're doing, and possibly lead to changes in those goals. It might start to, like, it would be an action step of really starting a conversation, I think. Even if you just use one of those, like joy, for example, or challenge, one or two would be enough, I think, to build a really important conversation in an IEP meeting that, as a first step, wouldn't require a big change. It would just take, 10 minutes maybe of discussion, but it could lead to important changes. I always try to think about the first step because, I mean, you have to have the vision of what you're after. But I think the first step is really important because once motion starts, it's often hard to stop, but it's very hard to take the first steps sometimes.
I must say that in that situation that Paulo was referring to, I was the advocate, and part of the issue. I mean, both of us with PhDs, we were coming at this from an expertise stance, and we were downplayed as not knowing their stuff. I remember in that context, this male guy, a white guy, who said, "Oh, trust us. He will be ready by year 13 of high school." And by the way, for people who are not from the United States, there's only 12 years in high school. So what they were saying is he will be ready when he's not here anymore. Um, so it's almost like a dystopia of sorts. I mean, as an advocate who's been working with especially folks who are linguistically different in this country, I feel like that first step is very difficult, even though is simple, because there is an epistemic injustice right there. There is not a horizontal conversation that respects the testimony of these people just because they are coming from the family side or from an advocacy side. They're seen as the enemy. So it starts with this compliance mentality. It becomes more of a war zone than a horizontal teamwork. Yeah, the law says that we are all part of the IEP team, but they see it in compliance terms as a risk management game. So it becomes a war game. And this is going back to the idea that policies tend to be walls. They tend to create walls that prevent even something like joy or love or freedom from emerging, and even rigor, because it's supposed to be, standards are supposed to be creating rigor, but they are so, yeah, so neutral, so dead, so part of the cadaver version of rigor, rigor mortis, that they just don't help. They just prevent the conversational space that needs to be there horizontally for this to happen as a first step.
And Rhonda, I really like your first step suggestion because it does, in a way, counter what Alexis just shared. This kind of wolf mentality, because I feel like the highlights of my 12 years of IEP experience with my son, there have been some, and that has really occurred, I think, when these kind of conversations happen, when you pose these questions to families, to students and teachers who, I think at their heart, they care about these notions of joy and freedom, right? Like how, to what extent do these goals approach these? I mean, and then, hey, let's kind of think together. I mean, I feel like it will foster that. I mean, these are the conversations that typically happen in IP meetings. However, if those questions are posed and then you have the opportunity to address those questions. Oh, let's address these questions about like these. How do we see these reflected in the IP as a whole? I think that's a wonderful step to, I think, interrupt, at the very least, interrupt the kind of conversations you have in IEP meetings.
You know, I'm very much thankful for just the exploration of these learning outcomes, because they're just not part of the conversation. Unfortunately, I think we have become accustomed to values driving education that are just non-human, very much neoliberal things, which justify the pizza stuff, all these assessments that are supposed to be connected to standardized learning, and all the conversations that are framed in terms of competition among countries to see which one will get the best people ready for a high-tech world, and that sort of thing is what drives the conversation. So you putting at the center these values, I think, is a very, very, very powerful paradigm shift in terms of keeping on going with this. So I'm very much happy for the time we've spent conversing on these topics.
Rhonda, we would like to see if you have any final thoughts. I know we took up over the time we promised we would take, and we can have this conversation, this really rich conversation, for much longer. But we want to have any kind of last thoughts you want to share, and if folks want to find more about your stories, your insights, your work, please let them know where they could connect with you.
Great. I do have a website called agileteacher.org. So it's agile, like agile, agileteacher.org. And we have some practice tools and different routines there for teachers to help them. And I think, the key is teacher education. We need to reimagine how we're preparing teachers so that when they engage and facilitate these IEP meetings and all of their practices, it's from a very different place. So I'm hoping that our work leads to or helps propel lots of different changes by the whole community. It won't be by us alone, for sure, but I hope that we can contribute in positive ways toward really reimagining teacher education, because I think we're not going to change P-12 student education until we change teacher education as they're, preparing it. It's a cycle. So I really hope that everyone who listens takes at least one first step toward ensuring all learners are learning every day and feeling love, joy, rigor, and freedom. Both the teachers and the students themselves.
Yeah, it's very, very powerful last word. Thank you so much, Rhonda.
Thank you so much for engaging with the DES podcast. We post new episodes every few weeks. The DES podcast is made possible and sustainable in solidarity with you and those who generously volunteer their time to converse with us. We hope you join us on our next episode.